Welcome to Rethinking Capitalism. This is Josh. In this episode, we speak with Dr. Charles Davis about the increasingly repressive conditions on university campuses, particularly in the context of Columbia University's conceding to federal pressure under the thumb of Trump's administration. We explored the broader implications of these concessions at the expense of liberalized notions of intellectual and academic freedom, student activism, and the role of universities as sites of political struggle. Dr. Davis highlights the historical and ongoing repression of student activism, particularly pro-Palestinian movements, and critiques the legal and institutional frameworks that perpetuate these violences. We also delve into the limitations of liberalism at fending off fascist infringement and the active participation of universities in maintaining these structures of domination. We also touch on the historical collaboration between Zionist organizations and U.S. universities, the erosion of diversity and inclusion initiatives, and the broader implications for the future of higher education. Dr. Charles H.F. Davis is a third-generation educator, organizer, and artist. He is a faculty member in the Center for the Study of Higher and Postsecondary Education and the director of the Campus Abolition Research Lab at the University of Michigan. His research and teaching broadly explore the racialized consequences of higher education on society, including the role of colleges and universities in limiting the life-making possibilities of Black and other racialized communities. If you like what we do and want to support our ability to have more conversations like this, please consider becoming a patron. You can do so for as low as $1 a month, bringing these conversations totally independently with no corporate, state, or grant funding. Now, here's Dr. Charles Davis discussing some of his work. Okay, so I'm here with Professor Charles Davis, and for one, we're starting to talk about your piece, Universities Buckle to Authoritarian Demands. And so recently, Columbia University conceded to Trump's threat to cut $400 million in federal funding by accepting an increased criminalization of its students in the dismantling of academic freedom for its Middle Eastern and South Asian and African Studies department. And a lot of these concessions are being made with very little guarantee of salvaging the already federal funds that Trump has already taken away from the university. And later in the conversation, we will get into the massive precedent that this is setting, of course, especially for universities that are far more reliant on federal funding. But for now, I want to start by talking about the repressive conditions set forth by universities across the country that have led to the abduction and the disappearance of students who have protested the U.S., Israel-led Holocaust and occupied Palestine, of course. So just to start us off, what have you seen in this regard?
So I think for most of us, right, this became most visible in the wake of October 7th and the ways in which pro-Palestinian organizers who had been on college university campuses for the better part of 5 decades, sort of responding to what they understood was going to be sort of a deliberate and concerted effort to obviously question their humanity and their dignity in these public spaces, but also their organizations as a whole. And so we saw the sort of immediate backlash by institutions to this organizing in the wake of what took place on October 7th. And I think most notably, when we think about the long tradition of organizations like the Students for Justice in Palestine and GUPS, which is a sort of precursor to that started in the Bay Area, that these organizations have always been assumed to be antagonistic to the way that the university sees itself, right? In part because of the university itself as an apparatus of empire in a place that has deeply and consistently sustained things like the military-industrial complex, the growing carceral state vis-a-vis its policing apparatus and its growing capacity to police and punish. So, of course, then it comes as no surprise to see the type of backlash we saw, which, at least in my estimation, was most evident at the University of Michigan in November as pro-Palestinian organizers simply, sought out a meeting to engage and talk and discuss with the administration its investments of its endowment into things that were supporting Israeli apartheid. And nonetheless, during that November 23 incident, that police were deployed, really in sweeping gestures that not only included campus police, but also police from the municipal areas. And given my work in and around issues of policing on college university campuses, this was not at all surprising because we know that there are, cooperative policing agreements between institutions and municipalities that allow for this sort of cross-jurisdictional ways of engaging in social control and punishment manifest and happen. But that often gets overlooked for, other things that were taking place at a number of other institutions, including, and most notably, right, the encampments that happened in the following spring. But I want us to be clear that what we saw manifest in the fall of 2023 is evident of the university's engagement with student activists historically. And, I would sort of argue as well, when we look at things like the Black campus movement, both the short and the long Black campus movement, that led to ultimately the integration of American colleges and universities, but also to the erection of ethnic and Black studies programs and the increase of Black student enrollments and, the development of Black faculty, that also then, right, universities were deeply antagonistic. We just recognized the 55th anniversary of the Black Action Movement strike that happened here at the University of Michigan in 1970. And based on the historical archive of both the movements that were happening here, but also at a number of other places, we had seen police response, right, to activists issuing their demands and taking up various levels of civil disobedience. So there is a precursor, right, that universities are well trained and disciplined in the ways of engaging in political suppression. That has also been evidenced, of course, in things in various anti-war movements that have happened on campuses, vis-a-vis the McCarthy era, also the Vietnam War protests. So again, when we look at the university itself, I think it's important that we understand it not as a place that is fundamentally about the development of democratic leadership and citizenship in a particular, but actually, sort of root institution and thinking about anti-democracy and anti-democratic behaviors that stifle a way of thinking about participation on a more open and diverse ecosystem.
Absolutely. And we'll touch on that a little bit later as well, but shift the gears just a little bit. There has been this overwhelming focus on the legality of these abductions, especially from those of a more liberal stripe, which has seemed increasingly pointless in my estimation. But your article states that, and I'm quoting here, and the key focus on legality obscures the interpretive nature and malleability of the law by authoritative power, end quote. So can you talk about this a little bit?
Yeah, so I draw a lot here on, the thinking of critical legal studies and critical race scholars, folks like Derek Bell, Kimberly Crenshaw, of course, Danny Solorzano, and others. But when we think about the law and we sort of think about the development of critical race theory out of critical legal studies, sort of the, primary assertion, right, that was that the law was a tool that was used primarily for the, relegation and suppression of racially minoritized people and Black people in particular. And so when we understand the law as a tool of power, then we also understand, one, the limited access to which we have as a source of recourse, although there have been obviously evidence of the ability to do that, but that the law itself is wielded in a particular way by power to remain in power, right, to reinforce the status quo. And I think the acute focus by folks on the legality of these abductions, right, the legality of the moves that are being made, misunderstands that the law is by design, right, not to really stand in the side of how we might conceptualize justice within our particular movement spaces, and particularly justice for those who have been always subject to state level repression and institutional repression more specifically. And so I think it's a missed opportunity to understand the seriousness of what's occurring and that the law isn't designed to protect us, right? Even if there are these, moments in which it has been able to be used to, limit or perhaps reduce the element or the ferocity of the harm that's occurring. We saw most recently, right, with Mahmoud Khalil's case, the judge was able to ensure that that case would still be able to be tried in New Jersey despite his abduction and then detention in Louisiana. And that is but, a sort of brief affront to what power wanted to do and use sort of the letters of the law to be able to do that. And so I think it's important just that we don't misunderstand that the law is not necessarily on the side of the people, right? That it is on the side primarily of institutions and particularly those consumed with power and property, right? We see that much of the claims being made against pro-Palestinian organizers are based on their threats to property, right? Not their harm to actual individual people and a lot of other speculation. But that I think the legal analysis is a bit limiting because as we know, many of the most immoral and deeply troubling things of this particular country, but also within broader society, were legal, right? The institution of slavery was legal. Jim Crow, segregation was legal in many ways, right? That those things are still able to be done under the guise of legality when we look at mass incarceration. So we need not then also equate legality with morality. And especially in this instance, when you have what people must ultimately perceive as institutions of moral authority in the university, that's not actually how they function and what they stand for when they're able to sort of cave and capitulate to these deeply unjust ways that the law is being wielded to the detriment of everyday people.
Absolutely. And I think it also speaks to like this almost inability of liberalism, and in my opinion, holds like a level of monopoly over, progressive struggles, even more those of like a more radical stripe, of course, to like even recognize its own limitations, right? And I've seen this a lot over the last honestly, since Trump has been in office, but like even before that, just this idea that in any other fucking context, of course, right? When you speak of other nations who have other economic or democratic governing systems, of course, and you will see how people will indict those systems or those economic or democratic or political systems in these other nations, right? When they have these hiccups, to say the least, right? These limitations to their, like, let's say if it's socialist China, for example, if there's something that takes place there, like it is seen as an indictment of socialist China, right? It's not seen, but the same in the U.S. context, when we see these things happening kind of routinely, right, systematically, there's not that same level of like, oh, this is an indictment of like liberal democracy, ultimately. So, and I find that like continuing reliance where like liberalism is always reinforcing itself, even in moments when it shows itself to be limited or just flat out complicit in the violence in and of itself. Yeah.
Right. And I don't want to get too out of my depth here, right? I'm not by any means a political scientist or even political philosopher to that extent. But when we think about liberalism as a political and moral philosophy, right? Like, I think the main insistence of liberalism is that it has equal access to the things that power has always had and wielded for more nefarious purposes. And so when we understand liberalism in that particular way, then we also understand that it is, completely impossible for liberalism to be a pathway to liberation. And I think that is how we are seeing sort of the, broad category of politics in the sort of accepted ways of doing that, particularly electoral politics, but also in what we've seen, right, most recently in the sort of, public reimagining and heralding Cory Booker's, gesture of the 25-hour quote unquote filibuster.
Absolutely.
So we see sort of like this praise of this, rhetorical injunction, if you will, on Trump's politics on the floor. And yet, like, what does it actually do beyond sort of the political theater, right? And to be sure, like, it can't actually be a filibuster if there's no legislation that's being proposed, that's being impeded on. So it then provides this performance that, yes, sure has some level of utility within a liberal democracy or perceived liberal democracy. But it's not a pathway towards liberation, especially when we sort of counterbalance that with the reality of his relationship to AIPAC, right? And the dollars that have been taken to, a particular form of Christian nationalism and Zionism that are deeply intertwined. And it's an insistence advocacy on behalf of Israel, right? And its quote unquote right to defend itself, and yet nothing in terms of the rights that are afforded to an occupied people. And so I think this is where liberalism is a dangerous and insidious ideology that many of us don't fully recognize that we're participating in part because we buy into this notion that we should have access to things that are really predicated upon the fundamental, destruction and dismantlement of the actual ways democracies can function, both domestically and abroad. So I really think we have to challenge that and have some distinctions between how we think we identify and the words that we use and what they actually mean and how they manifest in everyday practice.
Yeah, absolutely. It's been interesting to kind of like navigate that because I know multiple folks right across the country who are like dealing with like legal battles with regards to their own universities, well, even with as relates to the state, right? In terms of like their participation in these struggles happening that's been happening for the last 2 years or so. And they're like trying to articulate this like understanding and this knowing that like the state is not on their side ultimately. So like they're not going to get the benefit of the doubt for being in solidarity with the Palestinian struggle, of course, which is ultimately an anti-colonial and anti-imperialist struggle, of course. But at the same time, still like having to navigate those waters of like hoping, right, that for this one time, right, that they will see some, respite or some justice in their way, where they're not experiencing, repercussions and repression for further participation in these struggles ultimately. So, and it's a really like shoddy, walk, I guess, when it comes to these like navigating the legal aspects of these things and the fact that a lot of people are engaged in these kind of legal battles, and while also like, articulating and understanding just how much this is like, rigged against these very struggles that we're actually involved in, if that makes sense. So, yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. I think about, I'm like getting lost in train of thought because this conversation is so good and really appreciating it. But I think about, the extent to which power willingly might concede a particular exception and then sort of represent it as the rule, which allows you to buy in, right, to this notion that like, oh, if you just let the system work, then we'll come out sort of on the other side of it. And we see that in various manifestations of how liberal participation in democracy allows for certain folks, right, to sort of navigate the terrain, ultimately to be in a perceived position of power and success. And nonetheless, the majority of us remain disenfranchised. And I think about the types of, I'll say Pyrrhic victories that we have and the types of things that occur in this particular context. We look at other students who have been, sort of affected by this. I'm thinking of Mamadou Tall in particular, right, who was able to persist in a particular regard, and ultimately, levy a lawsuit and yet still has to leave the country because the conditions have been created that his safety is all but guaranteed. right? And that we know the university itself will not intercede and protect him in the way that it has not done so for any number of other people who have been summarily abducted under, pretextual evidence. And I think that is also really challenging because, for those of us engaged in that fight, we need to be able to celebrate certain aspects of the wins and the ability to chip away slowly but surely at the armor of these oppressive systems. But also, again, we have to think about, this sort of like broader visioning and imagining in which this is perhaps at best, right, survival pending revolution. And this is sort of this abolitionist politic, right, that articulates the need for world making. And some of that impossibility, I think what is challenging for people is not understanding that we exist in someone's radical imagination right now, right? That these like places and the world in which we live was constructed from someone's imagination, again, for, more problematic and nefarious purposes. And so we know that it's possible, but we also know that where we live in this present moment was first imagined by, our elders and our ancestors who thought it important to think of something in the, absence of the institution of slavery. And again, we can talk about the permutations and its afterlives, but nonetheless, they had to first be imagined by those who were deeply, situated in a material struggle that led to our possibility of even engaging in this conversation, right, as two folks in this moment. So, of course, so I think that is a lot of stuff that we're just kind of like wrestling with. That I think for me always does still have to come back to this materialist analysis that doesn't get too stuck in some of the semantics that, those of us in leftist conversations and spaces often engage in, really think about like the material realities and where we concede and where we need to amplify and agitate and escalate, right? Sort of strategies and tactics that might lead to something that's a bit more permanent.
Absolutely agree. Totally agree. Yeah, I appreciate you for that. And so I've also spoken to a few established scholars in this regard, and almost all of them have said some semblance of like not knowing how Columbia and the larger American university system recovers from this, right? And so I'm interested in your thoughts on this, with many, if not most, universities choosing to be, as you write, an active collaborator and facilitator in the Neo-McCarthyist erosion of legal due process, free speech and academic freedom, and shared governance to the detriment of its reputation and future relationship to the public sphere, end quote. So in your estimation, what is next for students, faculty, and the university system at large?
I mean, again, we've been here before, right? I draw, a lot on Shreesburg and Stelly's thinking and Black Scare, Red Scare, and the sort of, history that she draws upon that represents and draws really clear parallels between sort of, anti-communist thinking that is very emblematic in the way we think about anti-communism and anti-socialism in this present moment. And what we, I think, saw is like we were able to ultimately come out of that particular era. And what we saw as the sort of moral failures of institutions that were granted some level of moral authority was the opportunity to somewhat reinvent themselves, as these institutions always do. What I think is interesting in this moment is the pace and how rapidly the deterioration happened, right? We're only but 5 years removed from these sweeping commitments to, anti-racism at sort of the highest level, but diversity, equity, inclusion perhaps at a different level, and maybe for some institutions, even abolition. And yet within that very small time span, we've all but reversed course entirely, right, into the straight dismantlement of institutions. And one of the things that I find very troubling, if we take the spotlight off of Columbia specifically, is that, the place at which I currently work, the University of Michigan, has successfully dismantled its Office of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion. And to be sure, Michigan is perhaps had the most robust apparatus for institutionalized DEI in all of higher education, and has set the precedent for such early on in sort of, the later iterations now, which to me at least signals that if it can happen in Michigan, it can absolutely and will happen in everywhere. And so when I think about the idea of recovery, I guess I'm more concerned about redeemability, right? And that the university will kind of always recover in whatever ways it says it can. And that's both in terms of being able to keep its institutions intact and service, its various sort of interests, be them moneyed or, governmental. But like, I don't know that the university itself, much like the American Democratic Project, can actually be redeemable, right? Because the sort of buy-in that has occurred because of the, extent to which we've been able to integrate, the extent to which we've been able to gain access to resources, gain access to positions, that the deep level of institutional betrayal and the mass effect of that institutional betrayal, to me, suggests that the redeemability of the university should be deeply in question. And I don't know, if and when that is going to come to pass. Certainly it will probably be for generations, much like the, institutions that our elders, attended, whether they be historically Black colleges, universities, or, predominantly white institutions post-integration, that only now were we able to see some semblance of, I'll say, somewhat stability. And I say that to say that the types of harm and violence to which we've been subject, that also includes material violence, is also different than that would have come out in sort of the late 60s and early 70s. But at some point, right, there was enough time had passed, enough changes of guard had occurred, and the politics of the place seemed to seemingly change that allow for people to be reinvested. I don't know that that is something that will happen within, our particular lifetime in any serious or real way. And part of that is because, again, the university as an apparatus is wrapped up in the state project. And so if it's always beholden to, right, the sort of moves and whims of federal policymaking or donors and benefactors for whom, equity, diversity, inclusion, anti-racism is no longer in vogue and no longer profitable, then where does it go from there? And then what do places that are, for all intents and purposes, the Columbias, the Harvards, the Penns, the Michigans of the world that have been relatively stable in terms of diversity numbers across the board, including international students at a rate of about 40%. But also the revenues that are associated with the international student populations that have been recruited here. What then becomes about this tension of the competing interests between what the university has made of itself and its reliance on these revenue streams, and then being deeply antagonistic to the way the federal government is going about its business. And this is what I think is, particularly troubling, but also interesting. We saw that essentially many faculty and staff who were differently vulnerable in this moment did relatively nothing when universities were criminalizing and brutalizing pro-Palestinian student protesters over the last 2 years. Again, there are exceptions. But yet when their funding is, being attacked, right, that all of a sudden there's this outcry and concern. There's a desire to engage in organizing. And that might be where their interests lead them into, this types of political action. But yet many of my colleagues are not making the parallel that our inability and unwillingness to fight with and on behalf of students who are speaking truth to power is exactly why we were able to get to this point. They too would be under attack. And so I am sort of both encouraged and still troubled that it took this long for folks to say that we need to do something. And, if I have seen anything that feels encouraging at this moment is that I have seen folks get off the sidelines, but I have seen folks who have been rubbed the wrong way because of the erosion of shared governance. I just hope that leads into more deeply thoughtful ways of politically engaging with the university outside of the traditional accepted ways of doing politics at the university level, which could be, student government, faculty senate, and sort of formal ways that are also being disregarded by the university at every, ebb and flow, and want to challenge us to think about what are the other non-conventional ways that we can, call to account and apply pressure to these institutions, to their governing boards, and to their leadership, right, to deliver on the promises that they've made that they have failed to keep.
Absolutely. I really appreciate that because I keep trying to imagine the American university system will look like post-Trump, right? After all these liberal pretensions regarding the marketplace of ideas and all these different things have been entirely eroded, right? And all I can see is just these massive corporate blobs, which and to be fair, they already are that today. Of course, they were that the last couple of centuries, of course, as well. But it was just fascinating to see how many of them will use Trump's his own monstrosities to kind of explicitly embrace, being these sites of perpetual dispossession and captors of knowledge and knowledge production and just truly imperial incubators. Embrace that openly and honestly without much of the flair, the liberal flair that they've been, kind of tacking onto these institutions ultimately for the last couple of decades, of course. So yeah, I'm just curious if you see something very similar, just this embrace of no longer pretending, ultimately so, because that's what I really see with Columbia at the moment. It really seems it's very explicit at this moment in time. There's very little attempts to even disguise it a little bit or even try to soften the blow. It just seems really in your face. You know what I'm saying? And it's something about that I find really fascinating. I really think that it's again setting the precedent for other universities to follow suit, of course.
Yeah, I mean, I think part of this, and as someone who studies college and universities, is trained in the study of higher education, what I think it would help the public to understand is nuances, right, within how we think about the university, capital U, right, and really the higher education enterprise. And I think of that in the various ways we understand neoliberalism and the market-like behaviors that these types of institutions, which are, research dominant, and, as some have argued, are really, corporations and hedge funds that have academic divisions, are not the entirety of higher education. And so when I think about, say, the idea of an abolitionist politic or a campus abolition, that we might first look at the ground floor at institutions that are open access, for example, or 2-year colleges or universities, or those that are really predominated by minoritized folks, rather than these elite spaces that have mostly gotten all of the attention that, as you mentioned, have like for the better part of several decades, function in ways that are really about profit interest, right, and profit motives. And in thinking about that, which we've seen even at a policy level, as we've seen bans on affirmative action, both past and present, sort of manifest, right, is like those people end up going somewhere. And part of what we're challenged by is that we sort of, evolved the university to be something that's really about, supporting capitalist economies. And what we've not sort of recovered from that is the almost monopoly on the notion of like where knowledge is created and produced and whether that knowledge is valuable and to what end, right? When I think about what a, Research One university or major research institution may offer in the way of, intellectual thinking, that we see at a department level, those things are often underfunded by comparison to their more profitable counterparts, right? But that also, that in many ways for folks that are entering into a labor market for which there is not enough jobs, right, to even like match those who are coming out with engineering degrees or business degrees or any of the other, quote unquote, more profitable areas. What do we do with all of that, sort of knowledge and capital that's gained in the process, where these folks ultimately can't even work in their particular industry, which is also, I think, a particular type of institutional betrayal. And we're seeing, at least for minoritized students, levels of debt that have to be incurred to never really, come out of what we call a sort of a racialized debt trap on the other end of, completing these degrees. And so I say all that to say, in part, that many people would have us think that we need to do away with the university entirely. And I think there's a really strong case to be made for that, at least again in the context of the enterprise. But, I think about DeVariant Baldwin's assertion, and he has this really, brilliant book, In the Shadow of the Ivory Towers, that sort of talks about the history and the complications of how these universities have really swallowed cities and to the detriment of Black and brown and low-income neighborhoods. And part of what he sort of argues is that, well, should we concede the university, right? Are there not considerable amounts of resources that can be returned to and redistributed amongst people? And I think about all the ways in which waste has occurred at the university level. We think about the property that they hold and never ultimately use, right? Ultimately for the use of profits later, or the expansion of the research enterprise, or, the levels of housing and food and things that are just like, in abundance in places that are often located, at least in the context of urban universities, in communities that have been, extracted from. Could that not then otherwise be served? We don't have to throw away the entirety of what is there, but otherwise repurpose and redistribute those things. And, also for us, can we invest in other types of institutions that are more life affirming, that are more supportive and providing the things that are necessary for people to like live and make a life? I think those are all questions that we need to consider as we're questioning, like, what is the utility of the university at this present moment? And I think the last thing that allows us to think about that in a particular way is shifting our analysis from a belief that the university is what scholars have called the domain of solutions, where conversely, we think of society as the domain of problems, and the university is there to ultimately solve the social ills and challenges, without really understanding the way the university is a progenitor of many of those things, right? The contemporary university perhaps is the best, and most visible and longest standing vestige of racial colonialism in this country. All of these institutions exist on stolen land. Many were built, in fact, by stolen people who were asked to perform stolen labor and or the profits therein that allowed for those institutions to be erected, especially the colonial colleges. And so in thinking about that, right, we can then see how, when we're talking about the military industrial complex, you can't separate the university from that, right? Much of the research and development of weapons of mass destruction happens in the university, right? And we're seeing ties to that explicitly within what's been happening in the genocide against Palestinians and the various technologies that have been supported and propped up, even in just the relative military defense technologies and the types of Department of Defense contracts that happen here. And so when we do that, then I think we take a bit of that power that we relinquish to the university to solve things that is invested in maintaining and perpetuating because it is profitable. And I think that's just a really important way to think about, or rethinking rather, the role of the university and higher education enterprise more broadly versus those colleges and universities have a bit more of a utilitarian bend to them based on who they serve primarily and what things that they are trying to produce.
Yeah, absolutely. I appreciate that. And comes to your point earlier, right? Like you work at University of Michigan, and I saw a story, as you mentioned just earlier. I wanted to talk a bit more about that administration is getting rid of all essential services associated with DEI and replacing it with AI, which I thought was really incredible, to say the least. But you co-wrote and published an article titled "What's Under Attack: Activism and Institutional Conflict Within U.S. Higher Education." And in this article, you discuss how, and I'm quoting here, between 2021 and 2022, over 583 bans against critical race theory have been introduced in U.S. legislation, whether that be through individual states or in their respective Senate or House bills or through federal executive orders, end quote. So for a couple of years now, there has been a consistent drive to undermine and retaliate against not just the concessions of the 1960s, but even more recently, a kind of overcorrection of the kind of corrections that or concessions that took place as a result of the quelling of the rebellions after the George Floyd's lynching, of course.
Mhm.
So I'm curious to hear your thoughts on this and if you see a very similar connection as well.
In terms of the sort of response that we're seeing in this moment.
Yeah, because of course, like the concessions of the '60s, they've been on attack since the '60s, obviously. But I feel like there's something else happening too, where like there's like this backlash to 2020. It almost feels because I feel like people in 2020 there was a very much a push from multiple different institutions, right, trying to like, oh, anti-racism, oh, this, what I'm saying, trying to integrate further in a sense, and then like we're seeing kind of like a rollback of that happening as well.
Yeah, I mean, what we understand to be true first is, to sort of take a bit further back, right? The power concedes nothing without demand. And to be sure, any of the sort of measured progress that has happened in the university as well as in society is the consequence of everyday people organizing within a particular context to fight for the things that we currently have. But that has always been met with considerable backlash, right? And so when I think about this in the context of democracy and education and higher education in particular, I'm drawn to W.B. Du Bois's articulation on Black Reconstruction when he talks about, right, these sort of representational opportunities that were afforded in the wake of Reconstruction, right? And that we know to be sure that the amount of Black legislators, for example, albeit, mostly if not entirely men, was more in the period of Reconstruction than there had been in the 100 years since, right? And in part of that was that the, extent to which Black people were represented in American politics was met with considerable levels of racial violence, right? We can look at Tulsa as an example of that. We can look at Wilmington as an example of that. And that in many ways, Black political participation in the formal processes and systems was all but beaten into submission. And so I raised that to think about then what does it mean for us to take seriously an idea of abolition democracy in higher education in this deep period of decline. And part of that for me is when we think about the things that were gained and advanced as a consequence of the role of activism in the 1960s and 70s, right? That yet and still we do not have full participation in higher education, right? I think about all of the folks who were able to navigate successfully and become faculty members and to become, senior administrators and higher education leaders, and yet are still so easily rendered disposable by the university in this sweeping gesture with really like no serious level of recourse. And so what does that mean then to have, in this case, Black faces in high places who are not given any level of real institutional power? What we saw in the wake of what happened post George Floyd is that a number of places, if they had not already, instituted chief diversity officers, as an example. In some cases, that came with folks who had deep levels of education and expertise on what it meant to have a more equitable workplace environment, the campus environment. In other instances, it ended up being the most senior, racially minoritized person, or in many cases also white women who assumed this particular role, absent of a particular skill set or expertise. And yet in many of those instances, those people did not occupy the president's cabinet. They were not able to be engaged in formal types of decision making. And even if consulted, their opinions and perspectives were often disregarded. And so, again, I think it then raises this question of like, to what extent is there any value to become institutionalized, or what we call like sort of minority absorption in the university, if and when we are really being suppressed as a form of inclusion, right? And I think about that in this sort of predatory inclusion sense, that we're being included in the university, if only to strip us of our political power, to no longer agitate from the outside, but to think that we have some power that we actually don't have inside of a structure and system that is fundamentally committed to misunderstanding us and ultimately working towards our demise. And I think that is an instructive lesson as we think about the future of higher education, is that as people now on the outside looking in, despite still being within the institution, what are we willing to concede? And are we willing to put the needs and the will of the collective over individual aspiration to have entree and access to places that are largely not hospitable, that will always engage in forms of institutional betrayal? And if we think, again, if we care about freedom and liberation more than we care about these jobs, we have to make different decisions.
Yeah, absolutely. And in that same article, you and your co-writers also make note of how, and I'm quoting here again, collaboration between the Israeli government and pro-Israel U.S. college students, some indebted to the Zionist cause, to legitimize and promote positive portrayals of Israel's national image in the early 2000s. It has also included an injection of more than 8.5 million into campaigns and lobbying efforts to encourage university administrators to discourage and punish anti-Israeli protests, end quote. So I just want to, if you can talk a bit about this collaboration between the Zionist cause on college campuses, and not just the U.S. state, but the state of Israel as well.
Yeah, I mean, so we're in this particular moment, and we've seen, particularly from anti-Zionist Jewish scholars, I think about Moore Finkelstein and other folks, right, who have sort of written about this, about the extent to which anti-Semitism is being weaponized and used as a cover to engage in all kinds of anti-democratic and deeply unjust behavior. And part of that, I think, can be attributed to these sort of like longer, public relations and propagandizing campaign that isn't just reducible to sort of Israel's desire to portray itself in a particular way, but also the U.S. interest in Israel being, propped up as the quote unquote only democracy in the region. And I think it's deeply disingenuous and deeply problematic given the United States history of anti-Semitism and all of the ways in which anti-Semitism had manifested prior to, what is being said as the sort of crowning moment in post-October 7th. Right. I think about Richard Spencer and the Proud Boys marching through the University of Virginia in 2017, and Jews would not replace us. And yet that particular problem, the anti-Semitism on the college university campus, is somehow being dropped at the feet of Palestinian, Muslim, and Arab students and those who are supporting their self-determination. But that this is as much an American project as is, quote unquote, an Israeli project. If we think about the strategic utility of propping up, the nation state of Israel in that particular region, that in many ways, right, the U.S. has to be deeply invested in its public image, and why it then goes on supporting not just its consistent siege and bombardment of Hassa, Palestine, over the last 70 years or so, but then all the efforts that are being made by both the U.S. government and the Israeli Zionist state to then incorporate marginalized people in the United States into that particular tradition. And I say that in part recognizing the extent to which Black entertainers, Black educators. I think most recently I saw from, a colleague who I do not know, but it was shared with me, a delegation of leaders from the HBCU sort of space taking trips to Israel in efforts to sort of, socialize them into a particular version of what the Israeli state is in the absence of what it actually does. And as I think about that with regard to the narratives that are happening on campus, again, when we think about the role of Palestinian organizing on college and university campuses, that it has existed for, again, the better part of 50 years. And we've, sort of chosen to tell one side of that story in a way that props up, American foreign policy in a particular regard. And I want to juxtapose this a bit to, sort of point you made earlier with regard to the Middle Eastern Studies Department, which also includes a number of other, sort of race and ethnic-based epistemologies at Columbia being put into receivership. And what I think is unique, or not unique, but really important to understand about that is thinking about the role of Middle Eastern studies in the university and sort of its genesis, which was one that was not necessarily or inherently hospitable to Middle Eastern scholars themselves, right? And actually was in many ways a function of understanding the region and only effort to support, right, U.S. policy, foreign policy, and military, projects in that particular part of the world, and not one that was, rooted fundamentally in the assertion of self-determination or recognizing that as a mechanism in the way that we may assert similarly for Black studies. And so then it comes as no surprise that when, we are able to be in control of, to a certain extent, these particular areas, and we use them for the purposes of advocating for and advancing freedom and liberation for our people, that they become, highly scrutinized. And I wish that the university itself could just be more honest about its, efforts to do so in ways that I think betray sort of the intellectual tradition that we sort of espouse and say we value, and in ways that only care about diversity of thought if they're ultimately coming from the same people in a similar social location. And so I think the sort of relationship then, again, is going back to this idea of how the university sustains and supports the democratic project. And part of it is to, do its bidding by creating and sustaining certain narratives, but also following suit with regard to the characterization of what we've seen in the last 2 years, right? And I draw this to the House resolution that got passed that simply equated pro-Palestinian organizing as tantamount to terrorism, right? We saw this also within the Black Lives Matter era. This is partly why Patrisse Culler's book is, entitled When They Call You a Terrorist, why the Black identity extremism designation was created. And I think part of that, as I sort of close this point, is my rendering of this is that when the university has the ability to take what the federal government, albeit, biased in its own interest, and construct a otherwise democratically and politically engaged, quote unquote, campus citizen as something other than a student, right? Then it adopts the same types of apartheid lives that we're seeing in Israel, that there are no civilians in Hassa, right? In the same way that for students who engage in pro-Palestinian organizing, they have been rendered to be cast outside of what we think about when we talk about campus citizenship, and therefore no longer are able to access the rights and privileges, including the right to protection and safety that is afforded to other college university students simply by exercising their First Amendment right. And so I think that then constructs sort of this not dissimilar way of thinking about apartheid campus citizenship, in which we have banned people from being able to be on campus grounds, right? We have not allowed them to attend their classes. We are still taking their tuition dollars. They are forced to show a particular type of papers, right? Be that their student ID or, their visa status, which we know is called into question at this present moment, and are subject to routine surveillance, control, detention, and punishment. And so all of these things then, right, help us understand empire at a broader scale and the ways that these manifestations of empire happen in various locations. But the university is also one of those places.
Absolutely. I actually think that's a perfect place to end this off of. Yeah, this was great. So Charles, it was an honor to be in conversation with you. Thank you for giving us the time. And I'm sure we'll have you on again, discuss more of your work in the future. But before I let you go, is there anything you would like to shout out, maybe future projects, and if you can, maybe say a word about where folks can find you and keep up with your work?
Sure. Yeah. Well, firstly, thank you for reaching out and the opportunity to engage with you in this conversation. And I really appreciated, what millennials are killing capitalism affords us in the way of a discourse in this moment. And also to see like a lot of the homies and comrades, on, it has always been great. So in terms of takeaways, I just think it's really important that we do not yield the university to have a monopoly on where knowledge is created and of course how knowledge is consumed. And so it's critically important for educators, I think higher education professionals in particular, to not then allow the university to monopolize its time or its genius, and that we must engage and find community outside of the college and university context, that we have to be engaged in the political education of our communities and of ourselves, and know that that cannot be reducible to the formal, spaces in which teaching and learning is supposed to occur, that every moment is teachable and every venue in which we find ourselves can be turned into a classroom. In terms of, where you can find me, I'm on all the usual places, albeit reluctantly on Twitter still. His mama called him Twitter, so I'm going to keep calling him Twitter.
Okay.
You can catch me on both Twitter and Instagram at HF Davis. And you can also check out, some of the work that we've been developing at the Campus Abolition Research Lab at campusabolition.org, including our first season of our podcast, the Police Free Campus podcast, where we talk to organizers, scholars, and activists regarding imagining a police-free campus and a police-free future.
Absolutely. That was great. Thank you so much.
Yeah, my pleasure, Josh. Thank you so much for the invitation.